All right, CNT120, Chapter 1. We're now at the section of the chapter discussing the OSI model. This is usually a very large tripping point for people to kind of get this conceptual model in their brain and working on it. So let's go through this in a couple pieces to try to digest as much of this as we can. The OSI model, 7-layer OSI model. Why are we going to discuss this? All right, this is actually a way to take a large complex topic of how does a network function, or how does a network move data, and break it into smaller pieces to digest the smaller pieces. Same example, or I would say I use an example of, if I asked a mechanic, how does an engine work? Or how does a car work? Let's even ask bigger. If I ask a mechanic, how does a car work? They kind of look at you like, If I break it down to a smaller piece and say, hey, how do the brakes work? Well, that's a much smaller piece to like explain or diagram or draw out. They could easily explain, well, it's actually, it's this disc that spins and there's some calipers that go around and grab it, and that's what slows your car down. So if I take a complex topic and break it into smaller pieces, that allows me to look at that piece in more detail, or even explain that piece in more detail. So the 7-layer model is just that. It's a way to take the complex topic of how does a network move data from A to B and break it into smaller pieces so we can look at the little pieces as they go. The book uses an example of like mailing a letter. Yeah. Mailing a letter has to happen in a certain, and they use a picture over here, has to happen in a certain function. I have to like package my letter, send it, out into my mailbox, and the postal carrier needs to pick it up and drive it down the road. It needs to get sorted. Another postal character needs to drive it up the road into somebody's house, if you will. Well, data gets moved in a similar manner. Data literally gets moved in a similar manner. So, OSI model, Open System Interconnection Model, was actually developed in the 70s and the early 80s by ISO, International Organization for Standardization. It is just that. It's an international organization made up of many countries around the world to help with standardizing things like, I'm going to move a piece of electronic data from my computer here in this part of the world across the internet to your computer in your part of the world. How do we do that? ISO does a lot of standardization among things around the world. So the ISO developed the OSI model, again, late 70s, early 80s, as a way to say, hey, here's a standard model of communication, network communication. Because again, remember, in the 70s, all these companies were developing a network to connect their computers. Here's my network using my protocols, using my cabling to connect my computers. And 4 or 5 other companies were doing the same thing. So ISO comes along and says, hey, let's develop a model that if we're going to start moving data between each other, here's how we'll do it. And they literally have, I can go look at the X200 recommendation here from the ITUT. ITUT is a subgroup of the UN, the United Nations. This is a subgroup of the United Nations for international telecommunication issues, if you will. Their recommendation, the X200 recommendation, is what got instituted the OSI model and its set of protocols. Well, they built the model, and we still use it and still refer to it. They built a set of protocols that we don't use. We use TCP/IP, which is kind of the default standard around the globe, but we still use and discuss about the OSI model. It's still there, and we still discuss it. Side note, Mr. Brown was asked to explain the OSI model during a job interview many years ago, so it does pop up. So the OSI model, it's a way for them to develop standards around devices like, if I'm going to develop a NIC, it needs to do XYZ task for it to function on layer 2. If I'm going to develop a router, it needs to do XYZ task at layer 3 to move data through the network. So this was a way for ISO to develop a standard of communications around the globe for devices and things like that. For us, it's a standard for us to be able to communicate, network professionals to communicate how things are functioning. We can say things like when dealing with layer 4 security, when dealing with layer 3 routing, and people understand what that means. Or allows you to dial in on that piece. So this is going to allow us to break this complex topic down into pieces that we understand. It's going to give us this common language or a common form of communication between IT professionals. And believe it or not, it actually does help with troubleshooting down the road. When I start troubleshooting, I can literally think of things layer 1, check them off, move to layer 2, check them off, move to layer 3, check them off, and so forth. So the OSI model does serve a function for us for communication as well as troubleshooting. You're also going to find that it's handy when you're reading things. Authors sometimes will refer to when dealing with layer 3 routing, when dealing with layer 4 security. This will be a way for you to kind of understand what they're talking about. All right, so the 7-layer OSI model breaks the functions of communication, network communication, into 7 distinct pieces. And those pieces are called layers. And think of this almost like a building. Layer 1 is on the bottom. Floor 1 of a building is on the bottom. Floor 7 would be on top. They're purposely numbered like that. If I were to take layer 1 out of my network, pretty much the whole network would fall apart. That's the idea behind this. So layer 1 to layer 7. Layer 1 on the bottom, layer 7 on the top. And this diagram is kind of a reminder of the kinds of things that are going on at that layer. That's why I have this picture in here. So if I take a look, layer 1 physical layer, layer 2 data link layer, layer 3 network layer, layer 4 transport layer, layer 5 session layer, layer 6 presentation layer, layer 7 application layer. Those are my layers, and again, remember layer 1 on the bottom, layer 7 on the top. All right, a little bit, and this is actually a picture from our book, layer 1 on the bottom, layer 7 on the top. A little bit more here. We want to start getting our layers in the correct order. Again, layer 1 on the bottom, like the floor 1 of my building, layer 7 on top. And there's a way to help get these in order. There's 2 mnemonics that people tend to use. Some people use the mnemonic of this saying right here: all people seem to need data processing. For some people, that works to get your layers in order: application, presentation, session, transport, network, data link, physical. The other mnemonic that people tend to use goes from 1 to 7, starting down here at the physical layer. Please do not throw sausage pizza away. This is the one that clicked for me because who doesn't like pizza? So please do not throw sausage pizza away. Gets these in your order of physical, data link, network, transport, session, presentation, application. So find 1 or 2 of those mnemonics, either one of those mnemonics that work for you, and use that to get your layers in order, in the correct order that they need to go for our communication. Okay, so that's kind of your first order of business with the OSI model. Get your layers, get your layer names in order from 1 to 7, remembering that layer 1 is on the bottom, layer 7 is on the top. And again, that's one of the reasons I lean towards this one. Please do not throw sausage pizza away, because it literally starts at layer 1 for me. All right, when we come back in the next podcast, we're going to start going through the layers. We're going to go 7 to 1 down through our layers.